The Commission for Gender Equality hosted a webinar on Tuesday to discuss challenges experienced by women-owned businesses in accessing financial support from funding institutions. The webinar was themed Removing Barriers to Women's Economic Empowerment. And to tell us a little bit more about the outcomes of the webinar, we're now joined by Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who's the Deputy Chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always good to have you on the program. And an interesting webinar and a theme that you were looking at. What inspired it?
Well, one thing I know, a very good evening, Peter, to you and your listeners. Women are nurturers. I know that we are carriers of seed and we can give birth to things. One of the facts that I want to share is that if women's equality is achieved, the incremental impact this will have on GDP is quite significant at 10%. So women's equality will actually increase and enhance our economic output, our contribution to value add and economic output. And also gender parity is actually good for economic development because the purse of the woman actually reaches all niches of society, particularly with family and households. We also know that with COVID, the impact has been harder felt by women across the globe. There's lots of studies that have been done showing that the effect is not equal. Women in particular are hardest hit, and 59% of those sectors that are hardest hit are generally women-owned or women-headed headed businesses. So you're finding that the effect of COVID actually has a more disastrous effect on those who are in a lower income decile, and also in terms of gender. So it's both class and a gender effect. And so we've got to understand how then, when coming out of COVID, what are the necessary interventions to put in place?
So have you been able to work out why it is gender biased in terms of these challenges and the difficulties?
Well, I think that the driving indicators point to some of the systemic issues that we have found in a lot of the research CGE historically has done. For an example, we have seen that in the mining sector, in mining reports that we have produced, we've released and shown that the representation of women both on the supply chain but also on the managerial level is very low. We've looked at mining clusters in the different provinces and recommendations have been made to bring the transformation. So what this means is when you have a shaking in the economy, or what we call an economic shock, this is further aggravating the already weakened structural system in the ecosystem. For an example, the other issue that we've seen with COVID and the analysis that we've done, one of the other things we've done is what we call the legal investigative hearings for procurement. An interesting finding here is that with COVID, we have heard the president announce 40% procurement must be targeted and allocated to women-owned enterprises. When we did our investigative hearings and we looked at Department of Land Reform and Rural Development, we've looked at Department of Social Development, DBE. One thing we were unable to do for all is get the data because gender disaggregated data is simply not retained or kept. But where we were able to make findings through our legal investigative hearings is the Department of Basic Education. And quite concerningly, we saw that procurement to women-owned enterprises was at 3.65%, vis-a-vis the 40% that is targeted by the president. So the structural constraints, Peter, are some of the issues that we find are quite prevalent, and they are worsened then when there's an economic shock, because instead of now looking at these other issues of equity and redistribution, institutions simply want to meet targets, and these are overlooked. So this worsens the situation.
Is it partly because the procurers are mostly men that they perhaps are not gender sensitive as they should be?
Well, I think it's a policy issue. I think that when the president puts a policy imperative, for an example, let's pay SMMEs within 30 days. That's a policy imperative, irrespective of the gender of the administrator or those that are in administration. They should implement that for all SMMEs. So we find that irrespective of gender is a policy imperative. If accountability or implementation or lack thereof is not taking place, those that are in administration should be held to account. I think on the other leg, you're finding that the issue that is quite prevalent is that from the procurement side, there are no punitive measures, both in the private, by the way, and the public sector on the supply side. So you'd want to see gender parity in the supply side of private sector companies, where they actually look to develop women-owned businesses and enterprises in these sectors, particularly where you have a history of male-dominant sectors, or largely in the STEM sector, your sciences, your technology, engineering, and mathematics sector. But also, Peter, on the side of the public sector, you should have punitive measures where there's recourse for non-implementation of these targets. And we're simply not seeing that. And I think as the Commission, we are the watchdog that should then make recommendations in this regard to say our findings are as such, and we follow through year on, year out, because the numbers that we are seeing are quite paltry.
I suppose one of the challenges is capacity. A lot of women businesses are fairly new when we look at the history of entrepreneurship, and so they're developing the capacity. So you've got to find a way to speed that up so that when people are doing the procurement, capacity isn't one of the issues that come up. So, almost like this issue of, I want to hire someone that's experienced, but if they don't get it hired, they don't get the experience.
All right, so I fully agree that you've got to be able to deliver the service or the product or the good that you are procured for. So in having our webinar, we invited various partners, both in the private sector and in the public. We also invited institutions that are development finance institutions to say what can be done from a partnership perspective to increase the momentum in terms of this. So there are programs in terms of looking at how do you incorporate, mentorship, coaching, and advancing gender parity in this regard. But remember, market failure is not going to resolve this. You've got to have state interventions that specifically target underrepresented or marginalized groups that have previously been excluded primarily because of systemic issues. And this is the case in South Africa. So it's not enough for us to say there is a lack of capacity. What then must be done to increase and enhance capacity? So there's lots of skills development programs, there's a lot of capacity and what we call non-financial support programs that are offered by your DFIs. But I think the other incremental additional support that can be offered, I think in this regard, is offering products that are in line with what is needed by SMMEs. An example is in the agri space. A lot of agri-processing facilities need storage facilities, infrastructure like roads. This is non-financial support that can go a long way in aiding the entrepreneur. So instead of giving financial support, this non-financial support is quite crucial in being able to reach your markets with fresh products, but also being able to meet the quantum or the economies of scale that would be required along the value chain. The other aspect is having products that are actually enabling to be affordable to the finance, to the SME. So if the finance is more expensive than commercial banks that are offered by your development finance institutions, it is not necessarily going to help the micro, the small business. You actually have to have tailored products along the value chain, both for your small and micro firms, which employ less than 5 people. You've got to have tailored products for your medium and macro firms, which are about 50 or less than 50 people, but more than 5 to 10. But those that are 100 and more, these all require tailored products that are not necessarily the same along the value chain. And all your women-owned enterprises along the value chain differ. And I think when we look at the type of products that we have, they're not necessarily tailored to your small, your micro, and your medium. Most of the financial products in the market speak to your large firms, your macro firms that have collateral, that are able to source commercial support. But very little is offered to those that don't have necessarily collateral or are able to negotiate in the commercial banking space. And that is where it's imperative that DFIs look at your microfinance, look at your small and micro, and even the informal economy, which in many ways is excluded. And so these are some of the recommendations that came from that discussion that we had had.
Dr. Moleko, thank you very, very much indeed for giving us an overview of this important meeting that you had. And let's hope that things move quickly and that sometime in the near future we won't even be having these conversations, because gender parity would just be an obvious. But thanks so much indeed for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.